everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This is a question that I've been asked and I've heard recently. Let's just get to the question of the video. Will Bronze Age horror books eventually catch up to or overtake their Golden Age pre-code counterparts? No, not even by a long shot. So let's talk about why. First, the Bronze Age, when the Bronze Age started in 1970, the comic book authority code started to get a little lax. So you saw both major companies, DC and Marvel, DC in particular, start to come out with more horror books that have been widely absent since the mid-1950s. Since EC, Pre-Code, Atlas, all that sort of stuff sort of just either went away or just changed entirely their direction when it came to comics. So it's been absent for about 15 years. So like I said, when the comics code got a little more lax, you started seeing more horror books, more horror covers. And DC, I think, was the undisputed king when it came to Bronze Age horror. They had Bernie Wrightson, who penciled so many classic covers from that era, including the House of Secrets 92, which is the first Swamp Thing, but so many others. Neil Adams contributed to this, as did many other artists. Marvel had their own series. I know they had the Tomb of Dracula. They had their version of Chamber of Chills, Beware, Crypt of Shadows, Vault of Evil, it goes on and on. DC had House of Secrets. Well, House of Secrets and House of Mystery were both around since the 1950s. But again, they kind of reclaimed their horror roots in the 70s. But they had Sinister House of Secrets, Sinister House, they had Ghosts. There's so many of them that just I'm having like a Swamp Thing that I'm having like a complete block right now, mental block about. But there was a ton of them. So like I said, there was kind of like this resurgence of horror books in the Bronze Age. And I have some, many of you have them. Some of the Bronze Age covers in particular, a lot of the Wrightson ones, some of the Neil Adams ones are classic. Bernie Wrightson in particular, aside from the Swamp Thing, there are many House of Mystery, House of Secrets books that have really classic covers. So because of that question comes up. Do you think that, because, again, over the last few years, I've noticed in, the comic book communities, these Bronze Age books, these Bronze Age horror books, in particular DC, Marvel too, but in particular DC, these have been rising in price. The Swamp Thing prototype books, the Bernie Wrightson early House of Secrets, House of Mystery books, some of the Neil Adams stuff. I mean, it's really been all on the rise. And to try to get nice high grades of them have been, kind of tricky for some and very, very expensive. So that's why this question comes up. Do you think that maybe one day the Bronze Age books might, be on the same level with some of their Golden Age counterparts? And I answered that question already, and I said no. Now, does that mean every Bronze Age book is not going to be on the same level as every Golden Age horror book? No, there are some Bronze Age horror books that I think are a little more valuable than some Golden Age pre-code books. But I think the majority is that no, that's not the case. So why is that? Well, I've mentioned a few artists, and there are others too, like Kaluta and several others, right? Great artists. Gil Kane, I think, even contributed to some of this, right? You could correct me in the comments, and you could add into the comments who else contributed. But, you had a lot of great artists, right? A lot of them from the 60s, maybe not necessarily, maybe even some from the 50s, but a lot of great artists, especially up-and-comers around that period that contributed greatly to not only comic books, but to Bronze Age horror. And I say no, majority speaking, that no, I don't think they're ever going to overtake them. I think that, of course, when you're finding high grade, it's always rare, but it's rare for Golden Age too. I think that there are more Bronze Age horror books, more copies available. We got to think of it this way. When we entered the 1970s, comic book collecting started to become a thing. It started to become a thing, I believe, in the mid to late 1960s, when comic book collectors, you started seeing the buying the Golden Age books ads in the comic books. Now, people have always collected comic books, but they were kind of, in my opinion, outliers. It really wasn't a thing until you started seeing those price guides coming out, and then you had the Overstreet guide that came out in 1970, 70 something, early 70s, where, hey, these things are valuable, and people started to buy these books up, where they started looking out for some of those Golden Age books. They started looking for Golden Age Batman. They started holding on to some of their Silver Age Spider-Man books and all that. It started to become a thing in the 60s and definitely in the 1970s, right? Now, things obviously today move a lot faster, and values go up sometimes sky high overnight and drop overnight as well. It's largely because of the type of world we live in. We're all interconnected with the internet and stuff like this and so forth, whereas back in the 70s it didn't move as fast. But comic book collecting was definitely a thing. I think the first comic book long box came out in the 1970s. So my point is, there were a lot more copies of the majority of these books than there are of the Golden Age books. Now, some might say, well, they produced a lot of the Golden Age books too. Yeah, perhaps some. But when we're looking at today, and it goes back to my whole collecting thing, a lot of people started to become collectors in the late 60s, definitely by the 70s when a lot of these came out, and even up to the early 80s, where you can still get some of these Bronze Age books for cheap. And they were still in reasonably good condition because people kept them. Now, around that era, if you were trying to get some of the Atlas books, now granted, some of the Atlas books weren't as valuable because people were really into superheroes and all that sort of stuff. But it was a lot harder to find some of these books. The ECs were always the gold standard. But it was always a lot harder to find some of these books because a lot of these books were, it was back in the day when people weren't collecting as much. Like I said, those that were collecting back in the 50s and in the 40s, even in the early 60s, these were kind of like outliers. It didn't become big. It didn't start to become big until the late 60s, early 70s. So what I'm saying is a lot of people just tossed their books, or they didn't keep them in good shape. And there was a lot of prejudice against those pre-code books from the 1950s. And a lot of them were destroyed. Comic books in general were destroyed, right? So there are, in my opinion, there are less of them, and there are less in really, really nice shape of the Golden Age books than there are Bronze Age. So ultimately, the Bronze Age books, I think, are more widely available. Yeah, there are some that are very expensive, but they're more widely available. And I think it ultimately, because of that, and of course a few other things, not as desirable, and never will be as desirable as some of the other ones. You can't compare, I forget what it is, House of Mystery. It's the famous swamp creature coming out by Bernie Wrightson. That's like usually one of the big ones that people like to get, aside from the Swamp Thing, right? Because Swamp Thing's, a major character. People like that character, and they like the cover, of course, and they like, the art and all that stuff. But there are a few that really stand out, and one of the ones that stands out is, I think, what is it, House of Secrets 260 something? You correct me in the comments. But I think you know what I'm talking about, right? A great book, but to me, you can't compare that to some of the great Golden Age pre-codes. Scarcity or not, you can't compare the two. It doesn't compare to, and you would say, well, that's your opinion. Maybe, but I think generally speaking, you can't compare that cover to like Crime Suspense Stories 22, or Crime Suspense 20, or Mystery Tales 19, or Black Cat Mystery 50, or Chamber of Chills 19. They just don't compare. You could take the best from the Bronze Age and put them up against some of the books I just named. They don't stand a chance at all. And they will never be as even in the same atmosphere as those books. And I think when you have that much of a disadvantage, you know, the goldens versus the bronze, there's no catching up to that. Now, that doesn't mean that these Bronze Age books are not worth having and they're not going to be valuable or they hold their value. But I'm just answering the question that I think sometimes people, oh yeah, this is like the next best thing to a golden age pre-code golden age collecting. Well, I don't know, maybe. To me, I don't think so. But you know, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of great covers. All right. Lastly, though, I have to mention this though, and I know this might like ruffle some feathers, and it's not meant to be, but you know, those artists that I mentioned, you know, the Wrightson, Adams, Gil Kane, Kaluta, great artists. There's a lot of them I'm leaving out too, right? Great artists. But they're not Harry Anderson. They're not Johnny Craig. They're not Jack Davis. They're not Wally Wood. They're not Lee Elias. Okay? They're not Graham Ingalls. It's just a different breed. And the names that I just mentioned, it's almost as if Joe Maneely, it's almost as if these artists that I named in the ladder were bred. They were born to draw these horror / sci-fi covers. And we could argue that for Wrightson too, but even Adams did a great job. But Adams, to me, Gil Kane, they're more of a superhero artist to me. When I think of Neil Adams, I think of Green Lantern. I think of X-Men. I think of the Muhammad Ali versus Superman. I think of Superman. That's what I think of. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily think of all his work on House of Mystery, which he's done some work on House of Mystery and Secrets, which is great. You know, I like, what is that? The House of Mystery, I think it is, or House of Secrets, the robot cover. I think that's great. But again, it pales in the comparison to some of the even moderate pre-code horror books. But one that I say is so identifiable with Bronze Age horror is Bernie Wrightson. You know, he might be the one that when you think of Bernie Wrightson, you think of horror. But when I think of Neil Adams, when I think of Gil Kane, to me, I still think of them as superhero artists, and that's great. They're wonderful at that. Neil Adams is one of my favorite comic book artists of all time. But again, just making this last point, he's not in the same category as those other artists, those pre-code horror artists like Wally Wood and Graham Ingalls and, you know, Harry Anderson and so many others that we could just Jack Davis, name them. It's just a little bit of a different breed, in my opinion. And I guess that to me also goes into this conversation about, well, you know, will one overtake the other? It's not even a match, in my opinion. But everybody has an opinion, right? I just figured I'd share you mine. Okay, so what's coming up on the channel? You know, we're in the last few weeks of 2025, so you know my top 20. It's going to be probably like a top 20, maybe even a top 25 purchases of 2025 because I made a lot of purchases and a lot of upgrades. It's hard to contain it in the top 10. Obviously, when you're doing a top 25, there will be a top 10 in that. But for me, it's like, yeah, there's a few more to show. So that's going to be coming up. I have another comic book haul coming up. I'm supposed to have a couple books come. I don't know if they're going to make it for this comic book haul, so they'll be pushed off to the next comic book haul, which either might be in January and February. I don't know. But I'll make mention of it that it came this year. But that's another book coming up. That's another video coming up. And my want list, my top 12 or top 15, I haven't decided yet. My top 12 or top 15 want list for 2026. Of course, there are going to be a bunch of upgrades in there and maybe a few other books that were never in my collection. So that's what's next for this channel over the next couple weeks. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you tune in to watch those other videos coming up. And I'll catch you next time. Take care, everyone.